I'd like to firstly acknowledge the guardian spirits of this land and their descendants, and to thank them for allowing me to walk upon their lands. When I was a little kid, my mum used to take me for walks through the remaining bushland. We lived in Marrickville in Sydney, which is an inner suburb near home. She showed me the plants and let me smell the leaves or the bark or even the roots. She let me taste the nectar of the flowers and taught me the fruits that I could eat, which came in handy because when I was about 5, my dad was a scientist and he was working on, at that time, it was the beginning of the Second World War, and he was working on a sound weapon, which he did develop. And I became a danger to the public because I kept telling people about how good this weapon was. Yeah. And so they took me from school and put me in a foster home. And after the 12th foster home, because I kept running away all the time, they gave up and let me stay home. But in between times, because sometimes some of the places they put me, I only stayed a few days, sometimes it was a couple of weeks, but I always managed to get back home. And the last time was from a place called Gundabooka, which is far west in New South Wales and didn't have a railway line, but I found my way back. Anyway, Mum had taught me on my sojourns at home. Mum would take me down to the Royal National Park and she would teach me all about the plants and the medicines there. And but the last time I got home, Mum died. Anyway, she taught me the foods, she taught me the medicines, and she taught me about, which is even more interesting, about the relationships within the bushland. How everything, there's a whole lot of different associations, and I know that in the Sydney Basin, in Dharawal lands, we have 17 different associations growing, but over the whole of New South Wales there's only 111 altogether of these plant associations, and with those plant associations also goes insect and animal associations. And as Aboriginal people, Mum was a member of the Dharawal clans, and she was the granddaughter of a medicine woman. I never became a medicine person because I became more a plant person. She taught me how certain beetles that live under the bark of certain trees can produce a medicine, yet under other trees they will not produce the same medicine. This is the relatedness of the Australian bushland, and we tend to forget that. And in a lot of cases, and more particularly in the United States, which is really good, they plant great plantations of a single species of tree, of eucalypt particularly, and then they wonder why everything is destroyed by bushfires. Yes, silly men. Some of our plants also produce much stronger medicines when they are growing under certain trees. This always puzzled me because Mum would say, okay, this plant here is really good for this disease if it's growing under that tree. And I wondered about that, and it happens so often. When I got to uni, I finally decided to study it. So I went back into the history, and the very first botanist to explore our lands remarked on the diversity of the plant species within our lands, the Dharawal lands. The very first botanist, Solander, was, and his great-great-great-granddaughter I met some time ago, and And his notes mentioned the fact that the diversity of plants within the Botany Bay area was quite incredible. But even though he remarked on how the Aboriginal people used these plants for medicine, they started to cut them all down, didn't they? Yeah. Gee, they grow them good looking nowadays, don't they? Pity I'm so old. I got memories. Yeah. Yeah. The early settlers started to cut down our trees, and if you have a look at their drawings and that of the early days, you'll see the very first drawings with Cook, there's bushes and trees and everything. The land was covered. But as soon as as Philip and the settlers came, the trees disappeared. But with the disappearance of the Eucalypts came the diseases in the Aboriginal people. We did not have the immunity to the influenza, to colds, to measles. We had none of that. And that was because, or we had no defence, because our defence to disease was the Eucalypts. And again, studied the Eucalypts at uni and found out that that their vapour can repel and has repelled in Africa, where there's been, while I was at uni, we sort of recommended that eucalypts be taken to Africa so that they can be planted around villages where there was plagues and things. Did that, and it stopped the plagues from being spread by the mosquitoes. We knew that. We knew that the mosquitoes were bad, but we enhanced the growing of the eucalypts. You might realise now that the eucalypts are my favourite trees. They're great to climb. Lots of the funny little insects live in them too. When the white man came here, they cut down the trees and they started to plant all the plants that were all their well-known plants. And they started to plant them. And they started to take over the place. And most of our medicine plants were forced out by the growing foreign weeds. And the plants that we had were probably the best medicines in the world. Now we have both the British and the Chinese and the Americans coming out here studying our plants for their medicines because the normal medicines are now failing. Darawal lands is probably it is the best or the most different number of different species growing within our land. So we've got some 2,500 odd medicine plants growing in our lands, or medicine or food. Those that don't have uses in themselves support other plants. And this is what we called associations. And in Darawal lands we have 17 different associations, from rainforest to sand flats, each of which contain a combination of plants that make up that particular association. Some plants are common to a number of associations, and within each association those common plants will display slightly different uses. So that if you, say, put a Boronia in, which normally grows in the riverine association, if you put that into forest association, it'll grow and it will flower, but it won't have the beautiful perfume. At UTS a year ago, we decided that's the University of Technology, Sydney, we decided that we would try using a complete association on a balcony, a 6th floor balcony. So we had some wooden boxes built into which we put perlite, you know, the polystyrene little balls and that. We half filled the boxes with polystyrene. Then we put eucalyptus leaves in and eucalyptus mulch, and then we planted the plants in. And that was in May. By October, the students were eating the fruit off those plants. It was amazing. The growth was incredible. I got some photographs, but unfortunately I didn't have them on disc, so I couldn't bring them down with me. But it was amazing, the growth. We planted a tereticornis on this balcony, and Eucalyptus tereticornis, my favourite tree, and it was incredible. It had reached the next level up by October. It had been a tube plant. It had reached the next level balcony, so we had to take it out. So I adopted it and took it home, and now it's a year later. It is now over the roof of our house, because I use the same thing at home anyway. But the whole thing was, we are looking at plants that actually help each other. And we found also, so it started a study, which was really good at UTS, where we studied the why this all happens, why does this growth happen without soil, or with only a very minimum of soil that came in the tube stock that the plant came in. And so it was incredible. There is a mycorrhizal fungus that travels through the sap of the eucalypts. It then accumulates in the leaves of the eucalypts, and when the leaves drop off, they usually drop off after 6 months. When they drop off and fall to the ground, they start to decay, and that mycorrhizal fungus then migrates to the roots of the plants growing underneath the eucalypt. They attach themselves to the roots and then enable those roots to take up the nutrient they need for the plant to grow. It was really remarkable. Without the eucalypt growing there and providing those leaves, that plant would still be quite small, instead of being, providing fruit in the next October. It was quite incredible. We were very happy about that. The best part about it too, it was in the Aboriginal unit, or on the balcony of the Aboriginal unit there, that we planted the plant. And so all the other people came to have a look at it and admired our balcony. It doesn't matter. And that's the other thing too, is one of the first things that the early settlers said was that the soil was so poor it wouldn't grow anything. Well, it grew plenty of forests of eucalypts, Why wouldn't it grow wheat? Yeah, the ostromertus, that's a little plant. Its fruit is only very tiny, about the size of a small marble. And it is absolutely packed with vitamin C. And of course it's sweet, it's lovely, and now the students go out there and feed off it. And they're feeding off it from October. We were surprised. We had no idea that this would happen. And it was wonderful. Oh, and I forgot about telling everybody. The Eucalyptus tereticornis, in a tree younger than 7 years, has a memory enhancer. And if you've ever seen drawings of Aboriginal men, drawings done of the early days of Aboriginal men carrying a stick in their hand and with leaves tied around their legs, those leaves were the Eucalyptus tereticornis leaves. And when you when the messenger arrived at the place of where he had to deliver the message, they would put those leaves that were around his legs onto the fire. He would breathe in the smoke and he would actually remember the memory, remember the message that he had to send. So I knew this and I thought, I'll try this in my exams, won't I? And I did. And passed all my exams. In fact, at uni I did 33 subjects instead of 9. And the same time it took most of them to do. But it was, and it's a wonderful plant. You breathe in the smoke and from the embers, and it has this most beautiful smell. It's a very calming smell also, but there's so many other plants that we had. There's just so many. What I've got here, and I'll read them out to you. I'm going to read you out an association, okay? This is an association of a gully, and it's common to most of the north easterly facing gullies in larger valleys, right? And down our way in Darwin lands, it's one of the best medicine places we have. All right, we've got the Angulphora floribunda, which is the rough-barked apple. Uses, parts of this plant were used to treat severe diarrhoea. The roots provide a source of water in dry times, and I have used them in dry times. You only take the surface roots and you only take one root from each tree. The wood was used for the carving of weapons, implements and ornaments, and the digging sticks of the women, which are very good when you throw them at your man. My poor husband. Poor man. I'm glad he's not here. Yeah. The next one, this one's the Eucalyptus tereticornis. This is my absolute favourite. Parts of this plant were used to treat breathing difficulties, coughs and colds. The vapour from the leaves repels adult mosquitoes of the malaria vector. Parts of this plant were used to treat burns, cuts, sores and more serious wounds. What you did, the sap was taken, it was mixed with warm water until it was sort of thin, and then it was spread over the wound, and it was formed almost a cover, almost like a Band-Aid, except you could see through it. And it would stay on for about a day, and then you change it the next day. And it's antiseptic, it's analgesic, and antiviral. So what could you need other than that? And the sap was used to treat toothache, which is fun when you've got teeth. We used to, when we had a hole in the teeth or anything like that and it started to ache, we would get the little hard beads of dark red sap, put it in your mouth. But the thing was, you can't eat anything hot or drink anything hot after you've done that. You have to wait until the numbness has gone away, and then you can drink your nice hot cup of tea. It is also a painkiller too. Corymbia maculata, this is another beautiful tree. It's the spotted gum. Again, the sap was used to treat wounds. The hardened gum was soaked in warm water, and when soft, applied to skin lesions where it would form a film over the lesion. This was repeated several times a day. It wasn't as effective and didn't stuck on like the tereticornis did. The leaves were dried and smoked to relieve asthma symptoms, and this really worked. I use it on quite a number of occasions, particularly when I come or have to sit next to a cigarette smoker. Yeah. The gum was completely dissolved in hot water, which was then allowed to cool. It was carefully strained and applied to cuts, sores, burns and aching muscles, and it really is wonderful after sports and that. And thinned much greater with more and more warm water in it. It was used to bathe sore eyes. And in the early days, before white man came, we had a lot of problems with conjunctivitis, and that was the treatment for the conjunctivitis. The leaves and twigs were placed on a low fire and the vapour inhaled to relieve breathing difficulties. I think a lot of people may have smelt that beautiful smell of the eucalypts burning in bushfires, and it does relieve breathing difficulties, although some people say it causes it, but it's not that. The leaves were mashed to a pulp and taken to relieve diarrhoea. The inner bark was moistened and placed over the eyes to relieve pain and irritation. The inner bark of the Corymbia is softer and it's more pliable and easier to put over the eyes. Close the eyelids first though. Oh yeah, and this is another thing if you're lost in the bush. 2 metre length of near surface root, that's the roots that are spreading out near the surface of the tree. About the thickness of a child's wrist was cut and sealed at both ends with clay. This was carried while you were travelling, and when thirsty the travellers would remove the clay and drink the water from the root, and it was pure water. That's something I've done on occasion too. The bark exudate was soaked in hot water until it had completely dissolved. The liquid was then taken to treat internal hemorrhage. Now this is when you had a blow on your stomach or your abdominal area, and it was sore and swollen and bruised, and you use that on those sorts of injuries. The young leaves were boiled until the water turned green. It was then allowed to cool and carefully strained before being used as a wash for joint, chest or muscle pain and to relieve fever. Now the other thing we used to do, well, last time I did it was last Christmas, too much grog was taken, and we went down the river. We put some hot stones in a pothole in the river and put in the leaves, and then let the person with a hangover sit in there, and they became very pleasant after that. The bark was burnt to charcoal and crushed to a powder and packed into cuts made for ceremonial scarring. I do have one of those scars, except that I have white skin, and I ended up with a black scar, which is talking point. The bark was burnt to an ash, which was then mixed with dried native tobacco leaves and chewed before going to sleep at night. Now, one of the things I found out later on, when I was much older, the reason that the native tobacco leaves were mixed with burned ash was that if you didn't mix it, then you predominantly got cancer of the mouth. So this burned ash has some portion, some part of it which prevented cancer of the mouth. The bark exudate was dissolved in water and taken to relieve inflammation of the bladder. The wood was used for the making of canoes, implements and weapons, and the nectar was collected by washing the flower in water until the liquid had become honey-coloured. It was then given to the very old or the very young as a refreshing drink. And I have to admit that I didn't obey that completely because, well, it was a refreshing drink any time for me. The branches were snapped off and allowed to dry for a couple of days, then they were shaken over a mat of paper bark, and the manna was collected, rolled into a ball as an emergency food supply. A lot of people don't realise that the grey powder on a lot of the eucalypts is manna, the manna of the Bible, and if you can shake it off the trees or even wash them off the trees, it is a complete food. and that we used to use it for travelling, and I used to use it for play lunch sometimes when the teachers weren't looking. A 2 metre length of near surface roots would provide you with at least a litre of good water if you're travelling or if you're lost. Now for the Eucalyptus crabra. Now that's one of my favourite trees, except the tereticornis wins, the crabra would come second. That's the narrow-leafed ironbark. It's the tree that the tawny frogmouth owls like to nest in. And they're beautiful little creatures. I love them, and they're my favourite creatures, actually. But it is also a very, very useful tree, the ironbark. Firstly, the bark itself. On each tree, you would cut a panel about that wide and about 2 metres long, and the ironbarks grow all in a bunch together anyway, so you cut each of the trees and you would have yourself a nice little humpy, waterproof and solid and unburnable. Again, parts of this plant were used to treat asthma, that is breathing difficulties, bronchitis, coughs and colds. That part was the leaves. The smoke from the leaves was used to treat fevers. Now what would happen if a person had a bad fever, you would put them in a small shelter. You would light the fire outside the shelter in the direction that the wind was coming from, and the smoke would go into the shelter, the people would breathe it in, and it would very much relieve their fevers and their bronchitis and their colds and a whole lot of things. And also, if you were feeling down or a bit tired, you could do it for yourself. The bark was used, for the making of implements and weapons. The bark is virtually impenetrable by any kind of weapon, even a bullet. The fresh gum was collected and mixed with warm water, applied to sores, burns, cuts and scabies. And the seeds were soaked in water for several hours, changing the water several times. They were then dried and ground to a paste and eaten. They were edible. The bark was used for the construction of shelters, and the fresh gum mixed with hot water until it dissolved, and it was applied to burns, and the burns would heal. Now, some time ago, my husband, I couldn't open our pressure cooker, and my husband got annoyed with me because he was hungry, and he said, "Give it to me, I will open it." And it exploded and burned him, because naturally he didn't have a shirt on, did he? And he was burned, 3rd-degree burns from under his chin right down his chest and his arms. And I rushed out and got the gum, plus I also got the inner bark of the paper bark tree and put it on him, and then rushed him to hospital, and the hospital went off their brains at me, saying, "You shouldn't have done this to your husband, you should have just put cold water on it." And he healed without a scar. And now the hospital's looking at it. Yeah. Eucalyptus eugenoides, it's the stringy bark. Stringy barks can be quite dangerous. They have a tendency sometimes to lose their branches, so you never camp underneath them. The bark was used with the igniting of fires. The gum was collected and applied to scabies. The hardened gum was applied to bruises and spread over it was mixed in with warm water and spread over the bruises, and the bruise would be, after the next day or two, the bruise would disappear. Yeah, oh, and this one's good. I've never tried this, but my brother had. The bark from the young roots of up to 4 centimetres thick was ground to a crisp, then pounded and eaten. And I knew that he used to like that, but I didn't like the idea of, and the inner bark was used for the lighting of fires. The bark fibres were spun into string, which was then used for the weaving of dilly bags and hunting and fishing nets. The nectar was collected by washing the flowers until it had become sweet to taste. Now, in a lot of cases in the Australian bushland, the nectar of the flowers was probably one of the best medicines you could have, but collecting it was not so good. But by collecting, you would wash the flowers in water, spring water it had to be, and wash the flowers until the liquid became sweet to taste, and then you would give it to the person who was sick, or you drink it yourself, or the other thing you could do, and we tried this on several occasions, you would mix it also with the leaves of the Mentha piperita and put it in a cave, in a coolamon, in a cave with a rock over the top. Kitchen sink works just as well. And you left it there for 6 weeks and you had a really nice grog. Undetectable. Yeah, the gum was used again to bathe sore eyes. Also the dry hardened gum was ground to a powder. Again, it was placed in an airtight container. In the old days, we used the scrotum of a kangaroo and wrapped it up so that it would be absolutely airproof. And then we would use it when we needed to. But I found that nowadays, just putting it in a tin can is just as good, old malt can, and putting it under the sink. Yeah. And the bark, the bark has also healing properties. It was ground to a powder and packed into wounds for ceremonial scarring. That's when you want the scar to really stand out and be make you look so brave. Let's find something interesting for you. There's so many. Oh, Bursaria spinosa. I don't know whether you guys have it down here. It's a spiny bush. Okay, be careful. It's so useful. The leaves were mashed and are applied to wooden implements and weapons and to human skin to prevent sunburn or the rotting of the sun. Yeah, and but it has other wonderful, useful things. So many gardeners, so many people, even bush regenerators, pull out the Bursaria spinosa. But what it is that there's a little beetle. When the plant flowers, this little beetle, female beetle, she can't fly, so she climbs up and she goes up into the branches and she drinks the nectar. When she has a nice big feed of the nectar, she produces a pheromone which attracts the male. Now the male beetle can fly, and so he flies in and he mates with her. She then drops down to the ground, and then she wanders around until she hears the larvae of the cut-leaf moth wandering through the ground, and she burrows down and lays her eggs inside the cut-leaf moth larvae. And which is a wonderful thing because it destroys the larvae under the ground. But the cut-leaf moth not only eats the top of the growing tips of the gum trees, the larvae eats the growing tips of the roots of the gum tree. So it's being destroyed by the same creature from both ends. And this lovely little beetle, which lives on the Bursaria, is the thing that saves the Eucalypt's life. So where you see dieback with the Eucalypts, you know that those larvae of the cut-leaf moth are around somewhere. And the little lady is a cure. The bark of the wonderful Acacia implexa. And I noticed they had some growing, or some for sale outside. The fresh gum could be eaten once flowering had finished. The seeds were parched on hot coals, winnowed, moistened with a little water, ground to a paste, wrapped in paper bark and cooked as for damper. And it's really good because there's no horrible stuff in it, and like gluten and other things that occur in bread. Yeah. In springtime, the young roots were roasted and eaten. The bark was broken, this is one I like. The bark was broken into small pieces, then soaked overnight in hot water, and the lotion, when it had cooled, was applied to eczema. So, and that's usually my sister was badly affected by eczema, but she's quite good now, was quite good. And the leaves were used to dye the plant fibres. And it was actually a nice sort of orangey red that the plant fibres could be dyed, and you'd weave them into baskets and things like that. The black wattle. Oh, mearnsii. I don't like this plant. It's a weed, but it's also very useful, the Acacia mearnsii. Again, the gum the gum could be collected and made into little balls and carried around so that they keep for years and years, these little balls. And then you could dissolve them in water and mix the water with honey, and it makes a really good energy-giving drink. So when you're travelling, it's probably one of the best things you could use. Oh yeah, and the other thing, the bark was soaked in warm water overnight, and the liquid used to treat indigestion, which is really good when you get old. Daviesia, the leaves, Daviesia ulicifolia, I always can't pronounce that word. The leaves and branches placed on a low fire, and the vapour was inhaled to reduce breathing difficulties. This is usually during really cold times. The leaves and twigs were soaked in hot water, and when cooled, the liquid was taken as a tonic. And it is really good tonic, and if you put it in, mix it with a bit of honey, native bee honey, and put it into a dark place for about 6 or 8 weeks, and come back, you've got yourself a very nice drink, and I think my 5 minutes are up, aren't they? No. You're giving me some more. Another 5. Do you want another 5? Yeah. Oh, you're not bored? Oh, I am. Yeah, okay. Jacksonia. Oh, there's a Jacksonia, and I noticed one of them outside for sale. I was nearly going to buy it, and I thought, no, I've got to take it back on the aeroplane anyway. The inner wood was broken up, boiled in water, and when cooled, the liquid was taken to relieve stomach upsets. That's when you've had a bad night out. The strips of bark to 30 centimetres long were removed, the inner side scraped, and the scrapings were then boiled. The liquid is allowed to cool and taken to relieve diarrhoea, severe diarrhoea, and stomach cramps, or used as a wash for young children, obviously who didn't have nappies in those days. Alphitonia excelsa. This is the soap tree, and the leaves were rubbed between the hands with a little water, and the lather used as an antiseptic during initiation ceremony. So if there's any sort of bad or deep cuts or that, the water would provide an antiseptic solution for you, so there'd be no after effects. The leaves were bruised and soaked in warm water and used as a wash for sore eyes, more particularly during fire times. The leaves were crushed. This was funny. The leaves were crushed, then placed in a pothole in the river into which rocks had been placed. The water was then used to bathe persons suffering a severe headache. Where I live, we have a river, and it has these really deep potholes so that a man could fit into them. And I always remember we had one very fat fellow who was a friend of ours, and he was really crook, so we went down to the river and we put the hot rocks into the pothole, and then we put the leaves in, and then he got in, and he was so fat that all the water went out. So yeah, I had to laugh. We had a good giggle about that because we didn't like him very much. The root bark was crushed and soaked in hot water, and then you washed out your mouth when you had a very bad toothache with the liquid, and it does ease the toothache. The wood just underneath the bark was broken into small pieces and soaked overnight in warm water. The liquid was then taken as a general tonic, and it was quite all right, particularly after you'd done a lot of sports or exercises. Pieces of bark and root were soaked overnight in warm water, and it was rubbed onto the body as a liniment to ease aches and pains. And this one I like because I used it a lot. The leaves were rubbed vigorously between the hands to reduce the pain of certain activities, which receiving of the 6 cuts of the cane, which I used to get quite frequently. And fortunately, we had one of those growing in the schoolyard. Yeah. I used to do it before we got the cuts, not after though. This is a useful one too, the trefoil, the native trefoil. Desmodium, varians, and the leaves are crushed and rubbed on the skin to repel insect bites, and it really does happen. It's probably one of the best. The Dichondra, this is a medicine that you take every day. The Dichondra repins, which is the little kidney weed that grows in everybody's lawn. The leaves were sun-dried, then soaked in hot water, which was sweetened with honey, and the liquid taken as a drink or a tonic. Okay, you can either put it in a cave for 6 weeks, or you could drink it fresh, and it's a really nice tonic, fresh. It's really nice tonic for old people too, to make them feel better. Yeah. And most people treat that plant as a weed, and it's really not. It is a wonderful little plant. Pratia purpurescens. Okay, that was our cure for snakebite. The roots were ground to a paste and used to treat snakebite. The paste was covered over the snakebite wound, and and it didn't absolutely cure the snakebite, but it did ease it off, and you knew you wouldn't die when you had the plant. Okay, that's all the interesting ones. So I can stop now, can I? And have a heart attack or whatever?
Look, I just loved your little story about the Bursaria spinosa in the Sydney region, but for us here in Victoria there's a really special relationship which was made very public back in the 80s when it was discovered that a butterfly, which I suggested the name Eltham copper butterfly, was thought to have been extinct for 20 years since it was first discovered and named, and then it was rediscovered in an area about to be developed for urban development in Eltham. And then there was a great big campaign that was extremely successful in setting aside some land to protect a few tiny patches or colonies of this butterfly. This butterfly relies on the combination of an ant, which husbands it from being in the ground, in the galleries of the ant nest during the day, up at nights onto the branches of the Bursaria bushes, the Bursaria spinosa, same one that you mentioned, and it grazes in the night time when it can't be seen by birds, and then it's shepherded like sheep back down underground during the day. And the unique relationship is that it relies on the Bursaria as the only host, and it has to have the activity of these ants, these Natonka species. And if the Bursaria or the ant aren't present, or they go extinct in the local area, you will then lose the butterfly, which is extremely restricted. And this is part of a cascading effect that in biology we all understand, that when you lose a plant like you mentioned for the Bursaria in Sydney, or in this case the host plant for this very, very rare, amazing butterfly, then you'll lose all of the other plants and animals that depend on it.
That's right.
It's this extremely important relationship of plants at the top that once they go, carry with them a cascade of related dependent species.
I had a big fight with the native botanic gardens in Campbelltown, and they were cutting out all the Bursaria. And I had a big fight with them, and I won the fight, not by getting them not to remove it anymore, but by placing an Aboriginal place declaration over it. So I got away with that. And they couldn't touch the Bursaria. So, if you can't do it one way, you can oftentimes find a totally different way of doing it, and they're not expecting it, and so you win, and then they hate you for the rest of your life.
The Dharawal people were known as fire people. What does that mean?
People who live through darkness. Wallace people, okay, Dara, darkness. We live through the darkness. Now, I'm not quite sure what that means, but I do know that we live through, in one of our stories, it says that there was a time when the skies were dark for the time it took from a child to be born to be able to run. So, to me, that means that there was dark clouds or something like that over the lands, and there was no sun. The children had never seen the sun from the time of their birth until they were 6 years old. Now, one of the things we did do was when I was at uni, we did an investigation. We found a layer of volcanic ash. Now, you know how we're supposed to have been here for 60,000 years? Well, that's what they say. What happened was that this layer of ash was from a volcanic explosion in New Zealand that actually wiped out an entire island. And that happened 134,000 years ago. Now, we're only supposed to have been here for 60,000 years, so how could we know about the time? Oh, and they said that it was 6 years the dust cloud covered the southern hemisphere. So were we here then, or did we dream it?
The Royal Society of Victoria just recently published a whole series of papers which had in it a series of different investigations showing that evidence of the use of fire in the Warrnambool area dates to 120,000 years, and they're a little bit agnostic as to whether it is 100% evidence of Aboriginal fire use or a number of other explanations. But they came to the conclusion that the most likely explanation is Aboriginals were using fire in the southern coast of Australia 120,000 years ago. We're getting towards your 130,000 figure.
Right across New South Wales, from South Australia, central South Australia, right across to just the other side of the mountains, there are paintings of two circles. Now, over in the west, where these circles first start, the two circles are that far apart. At the Blue Mountains, they're together. They're just two circles drawn over each other. And 2.2 million years ago, there was what they call it, a supernova, a double supernova. Now, was that a double supernova? Because they were separate, the two circles were separate, but as they came across the state, New South Wales, they grew closer and closer together. And that was the question, what did those two circles represent? And then we found a band of tektites, a mile wide. And that was the explanation.